rhubarb, which afforded great shade under its huge leaves, was blown to smithereens, which isn't a small seaside town near Bridlington, but means to bits. Eddie's mother was horrified. She felt guilty for days and never ate rhubarb again for the rest of her life, except in crumbles, or with custard, or a light sprinkling of brown sugar, or white if there was no brown. Mad Uncle Jack tried to reassure her by saying that if the chap had been a half-decent soldier, he would have been heroically blown up in some battle long ago. And anyway, he strongly suspected that the fool had been chewing the rhubarb leaves, which are highly poisonous, so he'd probably have been dead by now whether she'd tripped and tossed the shell over the wall or not. Before we get back to Eddie and Mrs. Dickens crunching up the drive to Awful End, and her telling her son about the plans for America, there may be those amongst you who are interested to know why Mrs. Dickens was carrying the shell in the first place. Quite simply, it was because she'd found it in her sewing box. It was summertime, you might have guessed that from the size of the rhubarb leaves, and she was fed up with early morning light coming through the cracks between the curtains, so she'd decided to sew them together. Instead of finding her usual spools of thread, little pot of pins, packet of needles, and dried broad beans, graded by size, she found the brass mortar shell and nothing else. Puzzled, she'd gone in search of her husband, Mr. Dickens, who she knew was painting the garden. Mr. Dickens wasn't painting the garden in the sense that John Constable might paint a landscape, or Turner a seascape, with oil paints onto a canvas. No, Mr. Dickens was going around the garden, painting some of the leaves a greener green. As he was getting older, and he wasn't that old, his eyesight wasn't quite what it had been, and some colours, especially browns and greens, seemed duller, which was why he was going around with a pot of bright green paint and a badger bristle paintbrush. Unfortunately, unlike the whale, I have no idea whether this particular badger died of natural causes. I'm very, very sorry. Having found the shell in her otherwise empty sewing box, and knowing her husband was painting the trees, the garden was a logical place for Eddie's mother to go, and that was how she came to drop the shell where she did. Okay? Okay. I think that just about covers everything. So let's get back, which is really moving on because it happened later, to Eddie and his mother, on crutches, walking up the drive to Awful End that cold winter's afternoon. "You want me to go to America?" said Eddie in amazement. "Oh, no, hang on. Wait a minute. I thought I just about covered everything in the how she came to drop the mortar shell incident, but there are two glaring omissions, things left out. Firstly, who put the shell in the sewing box, and secondly, what it was that Mrs. Dickens tripped over, causing her to throw the shell in the first place. Both can be easily explained. The shell had been a present to Mad Uncle Jack from a local shopkeeper who didn't like him. He secretly rather hoped that M.U.J. would keep it over the fireplace, and the heat would cause it to explode, giving Mad Uncle Jack a headache and an expensive repair bill at the very least. That would teach him not to squish fruit and vegetables when he had no intention of buying them. Mad Uncle Jack had indeed put this fine, gleaming brass mortar shell on display on one of the many mantelpieces in Awful End, but it had caught the eye of his loving wife, even Madder Aunt Maud. Even Madder Aunt Maud was a woman who acted on impulse. The day she first set eyes on a stuffed stoat whom she later called Malcolm, she fell in love with him, and he became her almost constant companion. The day she saw the snout of a hollow cow sticking over a hedgerow, her heart went all a-flutter once again, and she knew there and then that she would call the cow Marjorie and live inside her. When she saw the gleaming shell case, she wanted it. I've no idea what for, she never said. And though I give a very good impression of one, once in a while when I say he thought or she wondered, I'm not a state-registered mind-reader. All I know is she wanted it, picked it up, and was horrified to see that her hands left finger marks and palm prints on the nice brass, which might tarnish the lovely gleam that had attracted her to it in the first place. She needed something to carry it in. She went into the nearest room, and there, on a stool by the window, sat Mrs. Dickens's sewing box. Not only was it just the right size, it also had a handy carrying handle. Even Madder Aunt Maud tipped the contents out of the box and swept them out of the way with her feet under an old upright piano, putting the shell in the box. She was just about to carry it out to Marjorie when she remembered that she'd left Malcolm the stuffed stoat on the mantelpiece. It was as she dashed out to retrieve him that Eddie's mother walked in and found the shell in the sewing box. It was just a case of bad luck and bad timing. If she hadn't wanted to sew up that gap in the curtain, or had come in a moment sooner and been able to ask Aunt Maud what she was up to, or had come in later, allowing time for even madder Aunt Maud to have retrieved Malcolm and taken the sewing box, Mrs. Dickens wouldn't be in the poor state she was in now. Which only leaves the matter of what she tripped over, mortar shell in hand, a now empty pot that had once contained green paint. And I don't think that requires further explanation. Immediately after the explosion, Mad Uncle Jack dashed down the ladder from his treehouse 3 rungs at a time. Eddie, who was helping Dawkins polish the family silver, dashed out of the kitchen door and around the side of the house. Mr. Dickens fell out of a laburnum tree he'd been painting, and Gibbering Jane, their retired failed chambermaid, stayed under the stairs. Even madder Aunt Maud was the last to appear, clutching Malcolm under her arm, and still frowning a puzzled frown at the sudden disappearance of the sewing box and shell. Mad Uncle Jack, Eddie, and Dawkins all ran to assist Mrs. Dickens, whilst even madder Aunt Maud ambled over to Mr. Dickens, who was lying on his back, moaning. She held Malcolm by the tail and prodded Eddie's father with the stuffed stoat's nose. "What's all the fuss about, eh?" she demanded. Meanwhile, Eddie's mother just groaned a lot and looked a bit crumpled. Back then, it wasn't simply a matter of picking up a phone and calling an ambulance. Dawkins was sent into town on horseback to find the doctor, and it was a good hour before both men came galloping back. By then, even madder Aunt Maud had made the gruesome discovery of the ex-soldier. Death is never nice, even in stories. She told Mad Uncle Jack, who was able to identify which of his men it was, he still thought of them that way, and they did often do odd jobs around the house, by a medal, still hot and slightly melted, in a flower bed. On it were the words, "Best of breed." "It was gory," he said quietly. "Poor chap." Dr. Humple took one look at Eddie's mother and assured her that she'd be fine in next to no time. He gave her the neck brace straight from his bag and arranged for crutches to be delivered, and had her up and walking about in a matter of days. Eddie's father was less lucky. The fall from the tree had hurt his back, and even as our story starts that following winter, he spent most of the time lying on his back, unable to sit up, let alone walk. "I don't think the author likes me," he once muttered. "I always seem to get injured in these stories." Of course, none of the other characters had any idea what he was talking about. It was soon after the accident that Eddie's father had a brilliant idea. He'd remembered reading somewhere about a famous artist called Michelangelo, who'd painted the ceiling of a place called the Sistine Chapel. Mr. Dickens assumed the man would have been called Mike Angel if he'd been English, but in fact, Michelangelo was just the artist's first name. His surname was Buonarroti. Mr. Buonarroti had covered it with pictures of clouds and angels and Adam and Eve and such like, but he'd done it all from wooden scaffolding built to the height of just below the ceiling, and had painted the whole thing whilst lying on his back. So, rather than lying around feeling sorry for himself, Mr. Dickens had the remaining ex-soldiers build him a wooden scaffolding rig on wheels, and he started to paint the ceiling of the Great Hall in Awful End. His food was brought up and his chamber pot taken down. Occasionally Gibbering Jane would clamber up and give him a sponge bath, or one of the family would join him for a while to keep him company, or mix him new-coloured paints. When he'd finished painting one patch of roof, they'd simply wheel the whole wooden scaffolding rig forward about a foot, and on he'd go. There's a phrase about making triumph out of adversity, which has nothing to do with the saying about making a silk purse out of a pig's ear, natural causes or no natural causes. It means making something good out of something bad, and that's exactly what Mr. Dickens would have done, produced a work of art when his bad back prevented him from doing just about anything else, were it not for the fact that he couldn't paint to save his life. Painting leaves on trees a brighter colour was where Eddie's dad's talent ended. If he actually tried to paint something to look like a leaf, it looked as much like an angel as his angels did, which was not much. The ceiling in the Great Hall looked dreadful. No, worse than that. If an unsuspecting visitor entered Awful End through the main entrance and saw the ceiling without warning, he might think either that some strange and horrifying multicoloured fungus had spread across it, or that he'd eaten some mushrooms which hadn't agreed with him and was having weird and crazy hallucinations. Mr. Dickens's ceiling